are. My name's Nuala. I'm tuning in from the historic Haight Free Clinic, where we're doing a drop-in tonight. So my apologies if there's a little noise in the background. So for those of you who are unaware with Homeless Youth Alliance, we have been serving unhoused youth in the Haight neighborhood for several decades. Our executive director, Mary Howe, lived on the streets herself as a young person before she found housing and got sober. The unhoused people we serve have, much like Maddie in the book, experienced extensive trauma in their lives. Many come from abusive or unstable homes, the foster care system, or juvenile care facilities. More than 70% identify as queer, and many have long-term mental health problems and use drugs to cope. They have a lot of distrust in services and institutions, and many of the programs created for adult people experiencing homelessness in the city don't properly cater to the traumas and experiences that young people have, which makes the work that Homeless Youth Alliance does even more important. With that in mind, Homeless Youth Alliance is really focused on meeting people where they're at. That means giving each person the power to define their goals and needs and supporting them on their journeys, whether that's accessing housing, therapy, or reconnecting with family. Today, the program consists of 3 main parts and a few kind of tangents. 5 days a week, we run a drop-in center, one of which is happening right behind me, where people can set up case management appointments, get sleeping bags and clothes, snacks and hygiene supplies. We also have a team of talented case managers who do street outreach. So they are literally meeting people where they're at on the streets and in the parks of the Haight to provide therapy, case management, give out hygiene supplies and snacks, and just generally be a voice for anybody who wants to talk through what they're experiencing. We run a housing program as well in Soma, where we have approximately 20 young people who were living on the streets, and it's a single room occupancy hotel, and we work with them to transition them to permanent supportive housing. When COVID hit, the youth we serve immediately faced a lot of extra hardships, as a lot of people did who were unhoused in San Francisco. Cafes and restaurants in the Haight shut down, and so access to bathrooms was immediately more difficult. Tourism dried up, and so leftover food and spare change was really hard to come by. And many of the frontline service providers shut down or started really limiting their hours. And so we saw numbers that Homeless Youth Alliance has never seen before. Starting in March, our drop-in center was just absolutely overflowing. And we rapidly had to adjust to create a COVID-friendly space as well, which meant reduced staff and kind of limiting the amount of people that were coming into the space. So it was a big challenge, but we adapted in several key ways. So one of the first things we did is reach out to the Haight neighborhood and ask if anybody had time and money to start donating food. And for the past, how long has it been? 10 months, we have been able to serve a hot meal to people in the Haight 3 days a week. It's currently happening downstairs on Haight and Clayton. We have someone who has been serving food every single Monday for 10 months for us. And that's a really enormous effort, and it means a lot to people, especially on really cold, windy nights like tonight. We also opened the city's second safe sleeping village, which is in the old McDonald's parking lot. We call it Camp. Where we have about 40 tent sites where people are sleeping, and we have showers and bathrooms and food for them as well. So that has helped some people connect to services in new ways, and it's a very new venture for us and a new venture for San Francisco to have sanctioned tent encampments. So that's something new that we've been tackling. I think overall, you know, it's very easy to look at unhoused young people on the streets and kind of think of them as victims and feel sorry for them. But I really want to kind of emphasize, as Katherine did in her book, that this is an incredibly resilient community, that the young people who are living on the streets of San Francisco are very strong, with a very strong sense of humor. They take care of each other like I've never seen before. People are really, really loving and caring towards one another. And even while COVID is raging, they have just managed to kind of survive and adapt and grow in ways that have been really admirable and surprising. So it is an honor to work with the unhoused people in the Haight, and it was a pleasure to read this book that so accurately portrays some of the nuances and difficulties that people face. So thank you all, and thank you so much for offering some of the proceeds to Homeless Youth Alliance. If you want to know more or become a donor, you can find out more information on the website homelessyouthAlliance.org.
Thank you, Nuala. I'm so glad that you were able to join us this evening and in the middle of work right now too. I really appreciate your time. Thank you. And I'll say once more, and probably again before the evening is over, that 10% of each copy of Katherine's book sold through us, Green Apple Books, is going to the Homeless Youth Alliance. So we have about 145 people tuned in right now. So if every one of them bought a copy of the book, that would be a substantial donation. So think about it. Did Katherine or Vanessa, did you have anything to add before I introduce you? Okay, wonderful.
I just want to thank you for your generosity in doing that.
It's truly our pleasure. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Nuala. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our authors for this evening. Vanessa Hua is a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle and the author of A River of Stars and Deceit and Other Possibilities, a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellow. She received a Rona Jaffe Foundation Writers Award, the Asian Pacific American Award for Literature, and a Steinbeck Fellowship in Creative Writing, as well as awards from the Society of Professional Journalists and the Asian American Journalists Association, among others. She's filed stories from China, Burma, South Korea, Panama, and Ecuador, and her work has appeared in publications including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. A Bay Area native, she teaches at the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers and elsewhere. She's a favorite of Green Apple. We're happy to welcome her back always. Please welcome Vanessa Hua. And I'd like to introduce to you Katherine Seligman. Katherine has been a writer at the San Francisco Chronicle magazine, a reporter at the San Francisco Examiner, and a correspondent at USA Today. Her work has appeared in Red Book, Life, Money, The Sun magazine, the anthology Fresh Takes, and many other publications. She lives in San Francisco. We're very happy to be hosting her this evening for the reason that you are all joining us as well at the edge of the Haight. Please welcome Katherine Seligman. Thanks to you.
Thanks so much, Car. It's a huge thanks to Green Apple. I'm really excited about tonight, and I want to say a thank you to all of you who tuned in tonight. I've done many of these events during the pandemic, and I think this maybe is the biggest crowd I've ever seen. So as Car suggested, if you all pick up a copy of Kathy's wonderful book, then there could be a huge donation tonight for homeless youth. So at the edge of the Haight, I would love, Kathy, if you could maybe start off by telling people who are not entirely familiar with the plot of the book is like just a little bit of the book, about the book, and then we can launch into discussion, and then maybe you'll read from it. And we'll I know there's a lot of journalists and former journalists on who there'll be plenty of time for Q&A as well. So.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here, and particularly great to be here with you, Vanessa, having worked at the Chronicle and just as a longtime journalist and novelist. This book is about the story of a young woman who flees her life in Los Angeles, ends up in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, homeless, assembles a group of kids around her who become sort of like a family, and there witnesses a murder, walks across the scene of a murder, and it totally disrupts her life in a new way. And she has to face the reasons that she's become homeless to begin with, and a lot of secrets that she's been carrying. So
and her name's Maddie, and her best friend is a dog named Root.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, that was something I really admired about the book, just sort of the vivid cast of characters you painted in terms of her found family, and also just sort of the people that she meets along the way in her journey. But maybe you could begin. I understand there was a sort of a dramatic incident, a tragic incident that you and your husband stumbled upon that was sort of like the genesis of the book itself.
Yeah, I had lived in the Haight for over 25 years, when one night my husband and I were driving home through the park, and a man just practically threw himself in front of our car and pleaded with us to stop. And he said someone was trying to kill him. And we stopped. We called the police, who came, and they shined a light over into the grass nearby. And there was the body of a young man. And my husband, who'd been an ER doctor, got out and to see if he could do anything. And he saw this kid breathing his last breath. And there was an investigation, but they let the killer go because there'd only been 2 witnesses and one was dead. And I think I just couldn't get that scene out of my mind, knowing that there would be no consequences for this man, and also just wanting to understand what had happened and why these 2 people's paths had crossed.
Yeah, and then and so I'm actually thinking maybe, do you want to read from the beginning and to kind of show how that was inspired, how it'll be sort of an interesting discussion of like how that led to your opening? Or were you planning to read from the opening, or?
Yeah, I can read a short part of the opening.
Okay, great.
Root sniffed his face and neck. The kid stuttered in a single long breath, and I stood there watching, holding my own. Root licked his cheek and edged his nose down the kid's chest toward a seeping stain of blood. In the middle, almost hidden, was a tiny slit in his shirt. I couldn't stop looking at the blood, the kid's halo of light brown hair, for once in 20 years on this earth. I couldn't seem to move. I knew I would see it for the rest of my life. Whenever I closed my eyes, he would be there, his life leaking out on the ground. Maybe it was true what my stand-in of a mother had said. You are going to end up damaged goods. I couldn't help copying her voice. You're going to be sorry, I said to Root, and pulled him away from the kid. I wanted to put my hand on the kid's chest to see if it was moving, but I couldn't get myself to do it. My heart was banging against my chest. Who was I going to scream for? Ash and everyone else. They wouldn't hear me.
Thank you. That's so powerful.
Yeah.
So had you ever, I guess I'm curious, had you ever considered writing it journalistically or writing it straight, so to speak? Or what was it about it that made you want to take the form of a novel?
I did consider doing it as nonfiction, and I initially did a lot of research, and I was looking up court records and talking to kids and talking to the police and doing what research I could. And I really realized that what I wanted to write about wasn't actual facts of the case, but the notion of how we come so close to people and have no idea what they're about or what their story is. So even if it's people in your own house, I mean, it could be your own children or your parents, just how little we can know. And that just sort of got to me, and I decided to do it as fiction because, as we know, and as a journalist, that you can't construct the endings. It doesn't come out the way you want it to come out. You can't necessarily write what you want to write about because you're so true to what exactly happened. And this is, I always want to emphasize, is truly fiction. I did talk to a lot of kids and people along the way, but it was a fictional story that I didn't take.
Yeah, I think with nonfiction or with journalism, research or the facts of the matter are sort of the ceiling to the story, but whereas with fiction, it's more that can be the floor, the jumping off point to whatever shape the story that you want can. And how did you, was there something about, how did you know you would the story would be through the eyes of a 20-year-old girl, or instead of someone older? Like, how did that narrator come to you?
That is a good question.
You got out your crystal ball and the spirits entered you, and that's how inspiration works. And right.
Struck me. Now,
Yeah.
what happened actually was I played around with writing it from different points of view. I did try writing it from 3 points of view, and then I tried writing it from a third person point of view. And I found that that using first person was really how I could best get into the heart and mind of this character. So it just sort of, and once I did, she sort of started to become real to me.
Yeah. So in terms of, could you talk a bit about just the work that you've done? We were chatting a bit before the webinar started, but just the work you've done around homeless issues, not necessarily as a journalist, but as a neighbor, as someone who lives in the neighborhood.
Yeah, ever since I've lived here, I've sort of been struck by the people I've met, which drew me to working quite a while ago, about 25 years ago. There was a family shelter right around the corner from where I live, and a friend of mine who is in public health and started her own nonprofit eventually. The two of us started a women's support group there, and it really showed me what it was like for a lot of people who were living on the street. And this was particularly for families, because it was a family shelter. It wasn't just kids, although a lot of the people who lived there were very young. And so that, I'd say that was really instrumental in showing me a different point of view than I'd had as a journalist.
Although, do you think what drives your journalism or drives your fiction, you just won the Bellwether Prize, which is for socially engaged fiction. Do you think there's something to your desire to write in ways that might enact a change in thinking or a change in action? Like, do you feel like, was there something with this novel that you were hoping to sort of illuminate, or, what does it mean to be a socially engaged, to write a book that's known for being socially engaged?
I think that so many of us do, we're writing about serious issues, whether or not we start out to do that.
Yeah.
In your novel too deals with, tremendously for people who,
or people on the margins, right? Immigration. Thank you.
Happen to have it here. No, but I think, and I don't necessarily think it's, because of your background as a journalist, but I just think that, if you look throughout, if you look at a lot of, classic literature, it deals with social issues. And I do think my background had a lot to do with writing it the way I wrote it and the subject matter. But, if you look at a lot of books that are being written, they do deal with social issues.
Yeah. Or, maybe you start with the character or the circumstance, but, it's about reflecting the world that we live in.
It is. And, I've always been really interested in the notion of displacement, and I don't know why. Maybe it's because I felt as a kid that I was, like unseen, like a lot of kids do, and just sort of spent a lot of time by myself, and under the covers reading a book.
Right.
Like a lot of us did. But I've always been sort of gravitated towards that issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is also a lot of what drove it. I was also more than 25 years ago, it was 30 years ago, that I accompany my husband, who does public health, to Sudan, and ended up doing a story on the kids that were living on the street in Khartoum. And I came back with a photographer for Life magazine and stayed for about a month delving into their lives. And there's just something about that notion of displacement that has sort of, interested me since then.
Yeah. Or, well, I guess two things. I think being a journalist is sort of a sensibility more than occupation. So like the way you want to engage with the world, no matter what sort of like you end up writing, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, but like there is something about going somewhere and not just taking it in, but like, I'm going to go one step beyond and like interview these kids, or like, I want to do something. It's like a way of engaging the world that is, I think, certainly is something that you can get trained on, but it's also like this sort of natural curiosity or empathy that you might have had as a kid. And then just this idea of displacement or being an outsider or not fitting in. Do you think having that double consciousness of like kind of watching, but then, knowing from within, like, do you think that is also, I mean, I guess I've always wondered this, like, are there any writers who were like prom queens and like super popular, or were all of us just sort of like watching and observing, or like, is that in the end become our superpower?
Well, I think, I think in a way that if you sort of come into it with this instinct to want to find out what's going on. And so when you walk down the street, you look in a window and you're always thinking, what's that person doing? And what are they, what would it be like if I was in that house? And, I think that's sort of an instinct. And then if you become a journalist, you all of a sudden it's okay to knock on the door.
Right.
Hey, what are you doing in here? And do you mind if I come in and watch? So, I do think those things very much came together for me. And I had started out actually writing fiction right after college and thought I would do that. And I actually did half of an MFA program before I left, because I felt like I didn't know what I wanted to write about at that point. I was 21 years old, and I know there are some very young writers who do know what they want to write about and have done it beautifully, but I did not. And I don't regret, my career as a journalist, continuing career as a journalist, but it was only later that I figured out that I wanted to go back to fiction.
Yeah, I also have an MFA, but I didn't pursue it until I was in my mid-30s. And I think even though I was older than many of my classmates, like it felt like by that point I had figured out what I had lived, but also figured out what it was exactly that I wanted from the program or the experience in ways that I might not have at 21. In fact, I think even though I was an English major, and graduated, like I had never even heard of an MFA. Like it was not even something that like crossed my radar. So just one of the things that's so lovely about one of the reasons why people do pursue an MFA is for the sort of mentorship or the community. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the Writers' Grotto, which we're both a part of. And I had known you from the Examiner and the Chronicle, but then sort of our paths were able to cross again through this community. And I know you joined a few years ago, and I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about what that's meant for you in terms of writing practice, or just having, you've been in San Francisco a very long time, but what does it mean to have not just the Grotto or, sort of other writing groups or communities? Like how has that been important for you?
Well, when I left the paper, the Chronicle magazine, I suddenly was working at home, and I really missed having a community. I did have, a desk. My kids were still at home. but it just really missed that community and sought it out, and was lucky enough to find the Writer's Grotto, where I shared a tiny windowless office with two wonderful other writers. And it really was a sort of like a place where I could go and close the door and feel like there were other people around me working. Sadly, for those of you who, well, it's not sad because the grotto is still thriving, but we lost our office because of the epidemic. And so I'm back working at home, and you know, I can do it, but I do miss that writing community. And I think it's really important, at least to me, it's really important to have, you know, that feel like there are people around you who are also struggling to do this sort of work that you're struggling to do.
Yeah, and I think that's so well put, because it's not just about like celebrating events like tonight, where we're celebrating your debut, but just like also knowing that other people are going through low points or rejections or frustrations, and either getting advice on that or also trying to just understand like, okay, you know, sometimes it's just about like last person standing in terms of
also to meet people who are like, you know, like you do. And now I have started to write, you know, in different genres. So that's been, you know, really nice to see too, as a wide range of, you know, of writing practices that people have. So I think it's important to see that.
Oh, great. And I definitely want to talk to you about what you're working on now and what you're working on next. But I did want to hear more about At the Edge of the Haight, or I don't know if there was another section you wanted to read, or.
Yeah, you know, I will, let me read, I'll read a section that's that gives you a sense of just of the kids being in the park, you know, the sort of community they have.
Yeah.
So I'll read a section of that. All right. The fog was settling on the trees, making its way through the sleeping bag around my shoulders. I put on an extra coat and another pair of socks, but I was still shivering. In Los Angeles, the fog sealed in the heat and sat on top of your skin. Here it pushed and pulled you in every direction and worked its way inside. Ash took a kazoo from his pack and started screeching on it. Hope slapped his hand and it flew over the tree branch into the dark. "You fucker," said Ash, and then he couldn't stop laughing. "You should play that thing when you get hassled. It's scary," said Hope. She and Fleet lay down and looked up through the fog at what fuzzed patches of stars they could see. Root was digging in the dirt furiously. I leaned against the tree, staring out to see if someone was out there, about to make a move on me. The light from the joint went around in a triangle from Ash to Fleet and then to Hope. Who knows why we all found one another? It happened. It was one of those things that you don't expect or maybe even deserve. "Hey, the moon is half full," said Hope. "I think it's half empty," said Ash. "That's because you're a pessimist," said Hope. "I'm an optimistic pessimist," said Ash. "Proving that you're an idiot, even with all your college classes." "I am bypassing you next time," said Ash. Hope laughed and grabbed the joint in the bossy way she had. Root let out one high-pitched bark. "Root, kick it down," I said. He sneezed and shook his entire body, ready to play. "Hey, settle," I said, and scratched behind his ear. He'd been cooped up in that big dog hotel room, no exercise, and so he was all wound up. But I had no intention of letting him go off in the dark. He wouldn't know what to do if he saw a coyote. I put my arms around his neck. Just thinking about leaving the ring of trees made me shiver more. I tried to change the subject in my brain by looking up at Ash, but it was too late. My mind was racing, fueled by the weed and a long day. I squiggled into my bag, pulled it up to my neck, and hauled Root down next to me. The wind rattled the bottles and leaves above me. Beats in the distance sounded like soft footsteps, or maybe it was fog condensing on the trees and dripping on the ground nearby. Root relaxed against my side. He would let me know if someone came near us.
Thank you so much. you know, I thought the way you portrayed the park was so vivid, and just the way I mean, even though they're exposed to the elements, there's threats all around them. There's like a coziness in that scene, which is just so lovely, or what people might not sort of expect when they, you know, read things pulled from the headlines, or when they, you know, pass kids on the street, not knowing about the sense of community that they're able to foster with each other. Oh, go on, Kathy. Yeah.
Well, I was just saying, one of the things that surprised me was how many people, this is pre-COVID, were actually living in the park, and that there were these little communities of people, not necessarily all kids, but a lot of them kids. And there actually was one little area where they tied bottles to the tree, and that's sort of one of the things that designated it as their home. And when the wind blew, the bottles would all, you know, click together.
Yeah.
But I just, over the years, I met so many people who lived in the park, and it sort of amazes me. I mean, there was a haiku poet who's published, who lived there for, he told us, years. And just a lot of other people who, unknown to the rest of us, had made their home there in a corner of the park. So it's really, the park is awesome in terms of what it offers people, but it also has become a home to people.
Yeah.
Pre-COVID, they're not, people are not living in encampments anymore in the park.
Yeah, there's a moment, I think, in the book where they're at the hospital, or she's somewhere official, and they're like, "What's your address?" And it's like, the park. Like, how do you explain that, right? Well, I was taking a peek at some of the questions, and it seems like we'll get to them, but it seems like two people had some questions that might apply to the passage you just read. But they were basically both asking about what it means to appropriation, or what does it mean to write about, you know, a community that you're not necessarily a part of in that way, and what considerations did you have, or, you know, any advice to writers who are sort of writing outside of their identity, so to speak?
And that's a really important question. So thank you for that. And I did think about that. And I had, as I said, I spoke to a number of people, a few in great detail, but again, I didn't write their stories, but I did talk to them about details and what they thought and what they saw and what was and what really happened. So I did feel that I fleshed it out as much as I could. And the other thing I'll say is there is a, you know, there's an element when you write fiction, I think, of going towards what you know and also towards the unknown. So I was, you know, I'm aware of that I was attempting both of those. I did feel like I knew this character, but you know, but there's some things that are unknowable, and we do have to do whatever we can to, when, you know, when we're writing about a community of which we are not a part. So I did what I could to sort of make sure that I was being as authentic as I could. And, you know, of course, that opens up a lot of other questions that we won't deal with tonight, but about, you know, about writing about other communities and their, you know, our lines that people have crossed. And
Yeah. Well, it's always interesting when sometimes you write about something and then maybe later, like I've had this happen where I write about a place I haven't been to, but then I kind of go there, and then I was like, oh, it's as I imagined. or even in my novel, like I didn't interview women in a maternity center, but then later, after I'd written the book, I found some interviews and I was like, this was exactly as I imagined. And I don't know if you had sort of that like feeling of like, I willed this into being. So
right. Yeah. It's, yeah, like you can't know everything. And I would say there are, you know, lines and places that a writer shouldn't cross. But there are ways of checking things with people and, and doing your research and being there. It's funny, there's one detail in particular that I had used because it actually happened to someone, and my editor, who was absolutely a wonderful editor, but said, would that have happened? Would she have done that? And I realized that, if a reader is saying that's a reason enough sort of to change it. But in fact, this had happened to somebody. So
or sometimes like, is the way something exactly happened the way that's necessary for your story, or
no. Yeah. And also, the two forms are very different, because if you recorded somebody's dialogue, it wouldn't be, it wouldn't work as fiction. So
right.
It's there's that's just a really interesting area of research and fiction. And I know people who write historical fiction are often contemplating this, and there's sort of this point where you reach what they call research rapture. Which you probably heard of, where you're so into the research that you lose what you're doing. And at times that did happen to me, that I would be walking along and trying to authenticate something and realize, hey, that's get back to the character.
Right. It's not germane necessarily. I think I often get asked this question about cultural appropriation. And I think the way I think of it, and I think this is where the journalism training might come in for the both of us, but just starting from a place of humbleness instead of arrogance. Like, I think as journalists, like, you're quite fine not knowing anything about something and having license to ask, rather than kind of like rushing in and assuming like, well, it must be this, and this. So like, but it's sort of the attitude. And in another way, it also sounds like you had an ongoing relationship with homeless in your neighborhood, right? They were your neighbors.
Right. They were my neighbors. And there were, as I said, there were a couple who were incredibly generous. And one young woman in particular who has moved away, but I was able to, to run things by her and ask questions about what her experience had been, and what it had been like for her.
Yeah.
Without taking her story. There's no elements of the novel that were story. And one of the things that really was at the center of this was having kids, and thinking about sometimes how I couldn't tell what they were thinking, and wondering, just that sort of basic sense of what if, which is what every parent would think of there are a lot of kids who end up in the park who have no resources, but everyone has a story and a family they came from, or a place they came from. And I just, that really motivated me too. The notion of the parents who would have found that their kid died in the park, and that nothing would ever be done about it.
Yeah, sort of the overtures that Dave, the father of the deceased boy Shane, makes towards Maddie are just awkward, but so moving, and just trying to find answers on his own. So I guess just to kind of finish up the discussion on about the cultural appropriation. One of the viewers is asking, did you have like any homeless youth or formerly homeless kind of do a pre-read of the entire book, or did you feel like that was? Some people do. Some people do these. What are they called?
Sensitivity readers.
Sensitivity readers, yeah. Like, or did you feel like it was more like you were incorporating that during your process, and so you didn't go that route?
Well, I didn't go that route. I thought seriously about that, but instead I opted to take a lot of material and run it by people.
Yeah.
And I feel like that was, it's interesting because as a journalist, I often double check things, but I wouldn't show an entire story
Right.
to someone. And I know they're different forms, but I did, it's a good question. And I did seriously think about that, but opted in the end to instead ask people to help me.
Oh, sorry. The problem with the locking doors is then they pound on the door, so then you leave the door open. So sorry. And in terms of just, I think people are getting lots of great questions. I invite people to add questions if they want, but it seems like people are very interested in how you just even went about meeting people and getting them to tell you their story. Were they guarded, or how did you establish a rapport, or even identify who you wanted to talk to?
What I did is, I sort of had, I had been talking to people, and at one point I went to an agency that's no longer in the Haight, but there was a group that was here for a while, and they were, I just asked them to refer me to some kids who were working in the neighborhood, who were formerly homeless and who'd lived in the park. And I met with them and, ran through a lot of questions. And I also it's talking to people. I would try, and I'm really think about this a lot now because I try not to intrude too much, but I found that a lot of people wanted to talk, particularly if I just came out and said, I'm working on a project and can we talk? And I found that people were open to talk. And I did a lot of the places, even though it's a fictional world. I went and sat in the ER at San Francisco General and, went through court records. During the time that I was writing the book, a couple really sensational crimes happened in the Haight, and that gave me a chance to talk to the police quite a bit on the street about what they knew and what they didn't know. And one of the, anyway, I don't need to go into what they are, but what really strikes me is the murder that was the seed for this book.
Yeah.
Was it never, of course, it never got any attention. There might have been one sentence, or if there was in the, nobody, just was one of those things. And there are so many people that die on the streets in the city every year. So, people whose names we never hear.
Yeah, it's always chilling when, like just even thinking about the opioid crisis and how many people have been dying during the pandemic, and it's a number, but actually they're people, people who love them. So,
Right. And so, so it's always I think it's always trying to be sensitive about talking, it's the same way as you do as a journalist, to talk to someone without feeling like you're intruding, and that they understand why you're asking the questions you're asking.
Yeah.
So.
Or I think sometimes maybe it's the first focus or attention. Someone's just they can sense that you're truly interested in their story, and I think people can respond to that.
Yeah, and yes.
Yeah. And in terms of the novel, who are you hoping, what are you hoping, it might help people understand, or how they might be moved to act? Or, so much, I think people, homelessness is synonymous with the Bay Area, and people see it everywhere they go. And so what do you think people might be missing otherwise, even though they are us, or they're among us, or they are us, right?
Yeah, I mean, you mean what do I hope that people take away
Right,
from
from the book, who in terms of their understanding of the homeless youth or the homeless issues.
Yeah. Well, we'll say, well, one is that I didn't set out to write about homelessness per se, but but definitely to write about, it's the whole backdrop for the novel. And I really hope that people see beyond the person sitting on the sidewalk with a cup or, asking for money with an instrument, and to look beyond that people are not just that, to realize, as everyone is, more than the externals of their lives. And so I just hope that there's a sense of keeping your eyes open when you walk through your own neighborhood and seeing who's there and looking beyond the surface.
Definitely.
And realizing that how little we know about each other. So
Definitely.
that's,
Well, and actually Heidi Benson, who we both know from journalism, she has an interesting question. Are you hopeful about the future of attitudes about and services for youth dealing with mental illness? Did you come to understand the larger historical causes of homelessness in the US in historic and political terms? And this is something I've been thinking about, like, so much, when we're writing fiction, it's like, oh, let's look at the individual and their sense of agency. But I think in recent years, I've been thinking about like systemic causes of racism or poverty or sort of the larger systems that we're in. And I don't know if that's something that you thought about with your book, or like how to kind of reconcile that need to understand the systems while still creating, individual characters.
yeah, I did think a lot about that. And I think that it's the systemic larger issues are so apparent in this city, the incredible inequality in income and the huge problem of affordability that has made this a city of rich and of poor, and other people fleeing. And I mean, that's the lack of resources and the basic inequality of resources is, largely what has driven this, I think, except for also there's so many individual, issues with each person. So that's another ongoing thing, which is that each person's issues need a lot of attention, and it's really hard to have a one size fits all approach to ending homelessness. I know San Francisco has been dealing with this issue, as of most major cities in the country, for so long, and as we've been unable to do much. And I think it has to, it does have to do with these larger issues of inequality and lack of resources that really need to change for us to see a difference in people's lives.
Yeah. I guess it's something I've been thinking about just as a writer, how you write about systems in ways that are comprehensible, or that are what is the power of fiction in being able to sort of manifest those systems, or to be able to, how do you describe the air that we breathe or the water that we drink, like when something's all around us?
Yeah, it's really hard. And the population certainly is different in my neighborhood in Haight-Ashbury than it is the homeless population has been different than the rest of San Francisco, primarily because there's so many young people here, which is different. And also people, there are fewer people of color here. It's tremendous social inequality and economic inequality across the board. And if you go downtown, you see that just hugely, and it's so apparent, and it's never been more apparent than it is now, when anyone who has any resources would be gone, would be, who could make a choice. Not everyone, but it's just these are some dire times, and I know I'm not without hope, but there's some people in precarious situations right now.
Yeah. Are you still in touch with any of the people that are they still around? Like some of the homeless individuals that you spoke with in the writing of the book, or
they're not. No, they've left. And I think over the years that I wrote the book, people moved on. There are very few. There is only one. I write in the book about housing complex that was the first and maybe still the only one to offer young people a place to live where it's not temporary. You can move in. You never have to leave. It's not a halfway house. It's not. And certainly there's a need for more resources like that for people. We just we don't have the answers yet, but there's certainly a huge caring community of people working on it, but we don't have the answers.
Yeah. And then just I think so the ending I would say is hopeful but open-ended, and could you talk about how you arrived there and how you, without giving too much away, but like how you decided like that was kind of the note you wanted to end on?
Well, I didn't want to tie everything up neatly because I feel like there was so much uncertainty in this character's life, and though she wanted to go back and sort of discover the secrets in her past and revisit that, she just had so many obstacles to overcome, even though there were people who wanted to help her, including this family that sort of wanted to adopt her, she still was facing so many obstacles. So I really wanted to keep it open that way, in a sense that there wasn't an easy solution. There wasn't going to be any clear redemption, because I think that's really the way it is.
Yeah. Or that there's a desire for, I don't know, the public or readers to be like, okay, and then happily ever after, but then,
Right.
It rarely turns out that way. I was glancing quickly over the questions as we sort of get to the final few. Just, someone was curious about the fact that there were resources, but often they felt hesitant, or the rule, it wasn't quite, they couldn't bring their dog, or they didn't trust the situation, or like, could you kind of talk about how you, how you sort of manage that with your characters, and sort of like, from the outside, people might think like, oh, but they could do this, this, and this, but then just sort of like that sort of suspicion or wariness about what it would really mean.
I think that there's often such a history of trauma that it's difficult for people to just accept and trust again. So, and I was saying, I feel like every person has a complex set of issues to be dealt with. And so, so that makes it hard too. But I just, I think that it's not impossible, but I just think there is a level of distrust, and people talk to me about that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I recall talking to one young man who just said, he didn't want to go into a program because he said, man, it's just like, it's the government, it's like FEMA, it's just like, they're going to take everything from me. I have to live by these rules. And he was just very, very distrustful. And I think that there is a lot of sense of distrust from a long long histories of what people have been through.
Yeah, which you so, and we didn't even really have time to sort of talk about Maddie's backstory and sort of the mental illness issues in her family that you so beautifully portrayed. But I think we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions, unfortunately, though they're wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone, for being so active and caring about this book and about these issues. But I will end with sort of a lightning round of some questions. Okay, so Kathy,
Yes.
New York or San Francisco?
San Francisco.
Okay. What pandemic hobby did you pick up?
Puppy training.
Okay. What kind of puppy?
She's a mix of a lot of spaniel poodle sort of mix, a little, you know,
Okay.
small, like a size of a chipmunk so
Okay.
far. But trying to, like spending a lot of time trying to work with, the puppy junior.
Okay. And then finally, Haight or Ashbury?
Haight.
Haight. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kathy. Thank you, Green Apple, and thanks to everyone who came here tonight.
Also make a plug for these. You guys are buying books. You gotta buy Vanessa's books, her wonderful book of short stories and River of Stars. And thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Green Apple. And do, buy books from Green Apple. Thank you.
Thank you both. We love a Vanessa Hua lightning round. So happy to see it. And tailored to Catherine's book perfectly. So appreciate it. Katherine, congratulations again on your publication. Let's, in case you folks have forgotten what the book looks like, you can take a look at the edge of the Haight. Katherine Seligman right here. Again, 10% of each copy sold through us, Green Apple Books, is going to the Homeless Youth Alliance, who you heard from earlier, and we're really excited. This is an incredibly well-attended event, and thank you all for your questions, and thank you for being so invested and interactive. I really appreciate it. And thank you again, Katherine, Vanessa, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all for
Bye.
coming.